If you've seen one of my videos before, you'll know I like to go down a rabbit hole or two, and that's easily done when you find an obscure story in an old Wrestling Observer. While I was reading for my recent Australia video, I came across an interesting note by Dave Meltzer from the August 5th, 2002 newsletter, relating to an Australian rugby player called Colin Scotts. Earlier that year, Scotts released his autobiography, with the brilliant title, All Balls, They Said an Aussie Couldn't Make It. According to Dave, Colin's book goes into detail about his time in American wrestling, and when I say detail, Dave makes it sound like the Hulk Hogan was nearly in Metallica kind of detail. That's to say, there doesn't appear to be a lot of fact there. Remember this for later. Dave writes that in the book, Colin claims to have been a WWF star in 1996, where he had a match with Jerry Lawler in Madison Square Garden, which turned into a shoot. He also claimed that in this time he became friends with Hulk Hogan, and says that he wrestled in Memphis, but hated the South and getting injured, so called it quits. I want to be very clear about this. The now 60-year-old Colin Scotts, number 69, nice, for the St. Louis Cardinals, clearly had a successful career in rugby, or football if you want to be American about it. This video isn't meant to bash him, as for all we know he's a decent bloke. I'm only interested in his claims about his pro wrestling career, based on what was reported when his book came out. My original plan for this video was to take what Dave wrote and look for any evidence to back up Colin's claims. He noted that Colin's book, quote, had wrestling fans chuckling, implying that this was a known thing at the time. Being a book that was released in 2002, seemingly out of print, with no ebook version existing, you'd have to be some kind of pedant to go as far as to get a copy of the book shipped from Australia, maybe even at the lowest price one could find. Hi there. Yep, I'm that pedant. It's even a signed copy too, to some bloke called Tony. You've seen how Dave rather negatively reported it. Now let's look at what Colin actually says in his book. Colin states that his entry into wrestling started in January 1996, and Dave dismissed the idea that he could have been friends with Hulk Hogan, based on Hulk being with WCW at the time. Clearly, it didn't occur to Dave that they might have met outside of wrestling. Colin actually does say in his book that post the NFL, he lived for a while in California, specifically Venice Beach, where Hogan was famously billed from for many years. Around this time, Hogan was acting in movies and TV, so might well have been in California around the same time Colin was. Quote, "There's no more entertaining place than Venice Beach in the summer. It's fun to sit and watch the amazing sideshows put on by the crazy mix of hippies, freaks, stars, footballers and wrestlers." At the end of his chapter about wrestling, Colin also notes that he later lived in Florida, even implying that Hogan was the cause of this. Speaking of Hogan, Colin states, "He's very big in Florida, and he got me interested in the place." From this point it became clear to me that Dave had never actually read a word of the book himself. When writing about Venice Beach, Colin says that he met wrestlers there, but the only one he names is Sergeant Slaughter. Colin says we became friends and he began to talk me into giving the game a try. At first I dismissed the idea, but as time went on and I found out how much money was in it, I started to think, as I always did, why not? From here, he claims to have sent a tape in. He met with Vince McMahon in Stamford, Connecticut. "There's no point wasting anyone's time," he said. "We just have to see if you have what it takes. So I want you to come with me and do a gig at Madison Square Garden." Just like that. Dave in his newsletter claimed that Colin said he got into a match that became a shoot in MSG, and that's not quite how Colin put it. In the book, Colin says of Lawler that he took to the ring and gave about 15 minutes of abuse about Australia. And even though in the back of my mind I knew it was all just a show, I found myself getting more and more angry. So much so that by the time I came on, I was really ready to deck him. What Colin described after this more resembles him working stiff with Lawler than a full-on shoot fight. Poor old Jerry. Between the thumpings he was saying, "The business doesn't work like this," which sounds like a lot to say between punches. Colin then claims he was, quote, "declared the winner," which doesn't make clear if this was an actual match or not. Try as I have, I couldn't find a single bit of evidence beyond what Colin says about the Jerry Lawler altercation. While Jerry was an active WWE wrestler around this time, the only match I could find in Madison Square Garden was at Survivor Series 96, where he would be on the losing end of an 8-man elimination match that also included the WWE debut of Rocky Maivia. I did find an MSG show in January of '96 that might have aligned with Colin's claims, but there's no mention of he or Lawler. I also looked at every other January that Jerry Lawler was active in WWE too, and still found nothing. Next, Colin writes about being sent by Vince to wrestle in Tennessee, where he notes he would regularly lose his matches. This is, as we know, how most wrestlers start out. To be fair to Colin, he implies that he didn't like losing or even selling, and even calls it an ego adjustment, but implies that he went along with it. Colin also mentions that he used the moniker the Thunder from Down Under, and walked out to the ring to the tune of AC/DC's Thunderstruck. In a different section, he notes that my nationality was pretty much chosen for me as my gimmick, something many a foreign wrestler can attest to. Looking at you, former WWE star Shane Thorne, who appeared once as what was described at the time as a Crocodile Dundee inspired gimmick. Not even his worst WWE gimmick, by the way, he was Slapjack too. Colin ends his wrestling chapter by noting that he suffered several injuries, including a broken arm and some fingers, and also a broken back, cracking a vertebrae after a big flip that went wrong. I'd had enough. My back had given out, and the pressure to learn more moves was getting to me. My hat goes off to the guys who stay in the game year after year. Honestly, based on what Dave wrote, I was ready to be entirely dismissive of Colin, but I'm glad I went to the trouble of reading his own words, as he throws in enough to show that he knows what he's talking about. There are a few holes that I can't quite piece together though. One thing Colin claims that I did find evidence for is that he did in fact wrestle in Tennessee, and given this fact, he likely would have at least met Jerry Lawler. Dave Meltzer claimed that Colin was in Memphis for a week, which is a slight understatement, and that comment actually made me want to buy the guy's book and verify what Colin actually claimed. The dates don't really match up though, as Colin says his wrestling days started in January '96 in his book, but I found evidence of 4 matches between August and September '93 for the USWA in Memphis. Interestingly, Dave noted in his writing that Scotts made an appearance at a WWE TV taping in '93, recording an interview that never made it to air. This was apparently enough for Scotts to keep in his biography to this day that he was a quote WWF wrestler, but not enough for him to keep up with wrestling for the past 22 years since the company changed its name. One thing I can confirm though, is that in every bio I've seen of him, even the one on the back of his book, and his current website, he notes that he was a WWF wrestler, with no details attached, and I've yet to find evidence of a single match Colin had in WWE. I'm even starting to think that he might just be that person every one of us as wrestling fans know, who just calls all of it WWE, the way not every vacuum cleaner is a Hoover. In the late stages of writing this video, I found a June 2019 episode of the Talking with TK podcast, where I could hear Colin Scott speak for himself. A lot of what he says about wrestling is rather consistent with his book, until he rambles about an instance where he apparently took out 10 people with a boomerang.
I went out in the ring, mate, and next you know I was throwing the boomerang and wiped out about 5 people, mate. I didn't realise, but later I realised after I'd moved the blood that it said do not throw boomerang warning. But I just throw this thing right. My first fight, I just threw the boomerang, wiped out about 10 people, and someone stood up out the back and goes, "You dickhead! You could have hurt somebody, you F-wit." And I'm like, mate, relax. No one's got fucking teeth in there anyway, piss off. So it was, you either had to have the crowd like you or hate you, and they thought I was throwing some axe into the crowd. It was a boomerang, but it got people excited.
He then makes a rather interesting claim about Stephanie McMahon, who based on Colin's own timeline, would have been 20 years old when Colin was around.
My mate actually trains Stephanie McMahon and Triple H.
Oh, I'm not going to tell you about Stephanie McMahon. Do not screw the crew unless you have to, Ross.
I want to tell him that. Good sort,
mate. She taught me about the sunset flip, let me tell you, mate.
So. Might tell Triple H this. He might have to verse you.
Don't tell Triple H.
He might have to verse you at the next WrestleMania.
Tell her I was before him, mate.
To summarise this video that's taken enough of your time, while I was ready to treat him with complete skepticism based on what Meltzer wrote, Colin Scott actually comes across as knowing what he's talking about, but is still quite brief in the details. I wouldn't go as far as to mock him like Dave did, and with some further reading, that paragraph in the Observer doesn't make Dave look that good at all. It was, however, a fun journey looking into this though, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Also, Elimination Chamber comes from